Welcome, everyone, to episode 26 of the Exoskeletons and Wearable Robotics podcast. We have a special guest today, Dr. Karl Zelik, engineering professor at Vanderbilt University and co-founder and chief scientist at HeroWear, and also a board member at the American Bionics Project. I almost forgot about that. Hi.
Hey, how's it going? I feel like one of those folks that calls into a radio show and says, long time listener, first time caller. I'm thrilled to be here with y'all. You all are doing an amazing job and a big service to the exoskeleton field. So thanks for doing that and glad to join you.
Thank you.
Wow.
I thought we maybe mention our Patreon supporters.
Totally. Thanks for the kind praise, Karel. Now that you have buttered us up, we're only going to give you easy questions. And as Tom mentioned, special thanks to our Patreon supporters at the VIP tier, Volker Bartenbach, Rita Vasquez Torres, Minmar, and corporate level sponsors, Humotech, Oxivo, Digity, Hypershell, and HeroWear, which Karel is a part of. Thank you so much for everyone's support. It really helps us get this through. So everybody ready to get started?
Yes.
Right.
So we were thinking of doing this episode more as a panel discussion where everybody gets to chime in equally. And our topic is going to be how the exo industry has changed over the last decade. So maybe we can start with the good things. What is the progress? What have we learned over the last decade? Who wants to start?
I mean, I'll jump in and I think that it's fun to have this in kind of a panel discussion format because you two have seen the journey as well, and it's fun to get different perspectives on it. Certainly the last 10 years has been transformative, in my view, for the exoskeleton field. And I think the biggest thing is there's been this shift in epicenter, I would say, from academic institutions out into industry. The technology has moved outside the lab in the clinical realm. The big milestone was getting the CMS reimbursement codes. The 10, 11-year gap from FDA approval to finally getting reimbursement codes. It took a long time, right? That's Apple Watch 1 to Apple Watch 10 type of time frame, but it got there. And so to see that change and the amount of evidence that had to be built in order to get the reimbursement codes for medical exoskeletons was huge. On the occupational side, we've really seen an explosion in evidence. Many of the things that we hoped to discover, early on when we were doing biomechanics studies on these wearable technologies, we're now seeing long-term evidence on injury impacts, on productivity impacts, on return on investment. We're seeing the societal impact that we wanted to see, and we're seeing growth in the industry, which is exciting. And then, recreational exoskeletons are kind of this newcomer and have infused a lot of excitement and are building general awareness and visibility. And I think we're having a net positive impact. So a lot has happened in the last 10 years.
And Karel, could you let us know, what has your involvement been in the last decade? How and when did you get started with exoskeletons?
Sure. And then we're going to jump back because I want to hear your perspectives. As you mentioned at the beginning, I wear a number of different hats. I'm an engineering professor at Vanderbilt, so I run a research lab that's focused on biomechanics and wearable tech, primarily to help people with physical disabilities or to try to prevent injuries where we can. So I've been involved in the academic research side. I'm also the co-founder and chief scientific officer of HeroWear, so I've been involved in technology translation and commercialization and the growth of that company as we started from laboratory prototypes and napkin sketches and are now supporting workers around the world in many different locations, many different industries, and it's been exciting to see that growth and that impact. I'm on the board of the American Bionics Project, which is supporting startups that are trying to develop technologies for people with lower limb disabilities. Some of these are exoskeleton technologies, some of them are prosthetics or other assistive devices. I'm also the chair of the VA Scientific Subcommittee on Rehabilitation, Engineering, Prosthetics, and Orthotics, so trying to help support research and development that will benefit our veterans. I've been involved in ASTM, so the development of industrial standards for exoskeletons. I do some side consulting related to biomechanics and wearable tech, and I really love science communication. So as you know, I'm active on LinkedIn. I maintain a science blog and am always sharing the latest updates on exoskeleton science or industry developments. So I kind of have a unique perspective that blends the academic research, but also the translational and commercialization aspects. Within this context, I am only going to be sharing my own opinion. I don't speak for Vanderbilt. I don't speak for HeroWear. I certainly don't speak for the VA, but I'm happy to engage with you all as folks that have been on this journey and seeing it through your own eyes and helped lift up the entire field. So hopefully I can bring some of that perspective, and I'm excited to hear what you all have to share as well.
Thank you for sharing that. And Tom, I think we'll go clockwise. You'll be next. So Tom is the one that brought the community together for the first time. So
I tried. So I was thinking about that, about where we've gone. So for 10 years, I'll start off with, we developed a Wearicon group, but where I don't know if you wanted to call it was more of an academic, but also industry. We definitely wanted to have the small companies and industry get together on a yearly basis at a Wearicon conference, and we were doing that in the US. We did 1 or 2 in Asia, and we've done 4 or 5, let's say, in Europe at this point. And I think some of the changes I saw was at the very beginning, exactly as Karl said, we were academics designing devices in our labs, and everyone was, wanting to push them out. And I think where I've seen some changes is that some of that has slowed down a bit, right? There isn't like 30 academic groups out there trying to build 30 different devices. I think you're starting to see some aggregation in the industry, certainly, let's say, in the medical, and starting, I think, in the occupational area. And then I think big things, exactly as Karl said, we're starting to get the medical people saying, okay, we're willing to reimburse for these devices. I always thought a big deal was once when some companies, I won't mention their exact names, but some orthotic and prosthetic companies said we're no longer just orthotics prosthetics, because that's where actually Karl and I started, and we're now a mobility or an exoskeleton company as well. I think some big things were some insurance companies started to say we're willing to reimburse for occupational exoskeletons. It was small, wasn't big there yet, but you're starting, I think, to see insurance companies say that. I always thought something big in the industry was, we never got the exact numbers, but Marisol was on our podcast talking about the successes they had at Toyota and showing that, occupational exoskeletons could make a difference in the workplace. Things I liked were the work by Fraunhofer, thinking about actually developing test methods. They call them parkours, but test methods that are being used by technicians. So it's not academics just saying, hey, here's what I see in my journal paper. I've got to show EMG results and I've got to show VO2 results. No, Karl was saying, I'm gonna have technicians use these devices. What am I seeing in use cases? Am I seeing productivity? Am I seeing efficiency? Am I seeing that it's wearable? Like, is it, I'm taking surveys, and he's collecting data, not by, just, 5 or 6 academics, but I'm, graduate students, but I'm collecting data with real technicians. So I think that's a big push. And I was going to mention exactly where Karl was saying that we're starting to see the last 6 months, this massive growth in consumer exoskeletons, which I think will get us into the mindset of people like, okay, it's cool to wear an exoskeleton, right? I gave an example, I think, to Bobby the other day, where I'm a latecomer. I tried an e-bike down a 2-hour beach ride, and it was a big fat tire, and it made 2 hours riding on the beach just absolutely enjoyable, right? I mean, I got on the bike, had fun. It was a vacation, so why should I be working out, right? And then I finished the 2 hours, and I wasn't exhausted, and we were having fun, and we were just riding down the beaches of in France, and it was just absolutely stunning and nice. And so what I heard from Bobby was these consumer exoskeletons are an e-bike for the legs. And I think if we get that meme out there, I think it's going to become more and more popular. And I think one last change for us, and this is going to be tough for the US, I think a bit, is the exoskeleton hardware, the cost of the hardware coming out of some of these outstanding, companies that are in China. The hardware prices are just unbelievable. Like, and I'll end on that where it's like, you're seeing motor technology at the $1,000 level, so it can get into the consumer market, right? Because batteries got cheaper, sensors got cheaper, but motors and actuators didn't. And now, a $300 motor gearbox combination with the controller is pretty darn amazing. And I think that's going to be interesting for our community, because someone, like, I'll just give one quick example. Someone was showing me a humanoid. I know humanoids are different than exos, but still, someone was showing me a $6,000 humanoid doing cartwheels the other day. And it's like a 10 motor device for $6,000. I was
That's awesome. We're going to need more than one podcast to go through all these things. I'd like to put a pin in a couple of these. One is, you talked about the, let's say, industry or longitudinal data related to occupational exoskeletons. This is an area I think we should dig into a little later in this conversation. It has grown by orders and orders of magnitude over the last 10 years. And I think to a point where people don't even realize the kind of full corpus of data and evidence that's out there. I think that's one of the things that has me most excited about the exoskeleton field right now. Second is, we should chat a little bit about recreational exoskeletons. I think that could be fun a bit later. And some of the other trends. Now, I think the focus today was going to be on what's changed in the last 10 years. I think we could have a whole nother conversation about, what's coming up in the next 5 or 10, and we can kind of see where the conversation leads us. Right. One thing I wanted to jump into before Bobby mentioned this, and I kind of want to sing a little bit of Tom's praises. Tom, you won't remember this. I don't think I ever told you this story, but when I was a first year grad student, very first year I got into biomechanics and assistive tech, I met you at a conference, and I think you were probably brought in to give one of the keynotes. You came in with some of your amazing robotic, probably prosthetic work at the time, lower limb stuff, and it was amazing. And as a first-year grad student, people like you were intimidating. I mean, I was just learning the basics, but I remember having a conversation with you there, and at one point, you like pulled me aside and we sat down and you started deriving these equations about the relationships between springs and energy storage and some of the fundamentals. And it really struck me. And, you've been a role model of mine in the field, not just because of your work in building up Wearable Robotics Association and all the other leadership roles you've taken, but, the way you carried yourself, to see somebody who was so accomplished to take a first year grad student over and like explain the fundamentals. And it also helped me understand people that you see their outputs, you see the cool technology they came up with, or the progress, but to kind of see how your mind works, to see the mastery, and then to see your willingness to share that left an impression on me. And so I wanted to thank you for that. And I don't know that kind of everyone has seen that behind the hood view of you, in addition to your amazing leadership. So again, it's a pleasure to be on this podcast, but even more so just to have somebody like you in the field that's been a role model, that's been a leader, that's been uplifting. So thank you for that. And I kind of wanted to give you a shout out.
Thanks, Carl. I appreciate it. So Bobby, I think it's your shot at what's happened some of the biggest changes over the last 10 years.
Yeah, so 10 years is a good number for me. I've been looking at exoskeleton technology for more than that, but about 11 years ago, I started with biomechatronics.net, then poweredexoskeletons.com, and then finally Exoskeleton Report. And I initially thought that I'll be starting my own engineering company, and quickly realized that there just wasn't really much communication or understanding of who's doing what. And to get people excited, especially me living in Silicon Valley, the land of investment capital, you talk to investors, you talk to technology gurus, and they have no concept of what a wearable robotic device is, of what an exoskeleton is, of what an exosuit is, and they're not excited. They cannot imagine the benefit that can have. So that's really got me on the communication side. So I completely agree with Tom. I think finally we are seeing a drop in cost of all the parts that put together an exoskeleton. And as someone again that's in Silicon Valley, there are parallels to that. We have the personal computer explosion, we have the iPhone, we have the Apple Watch, because of that constant decrease in cost to make a semiconductor chip, which was for decades, it was every year it was cut in half and then cut in half again. So we're finally seeing that on the exoskeleton side. We're finally seeing, like Karl said, there's like so much information now being published. It's not clear if people can keep up with it. 10 years ago, you could not fill a website with information on this technology. The idea that we've had a digital revolution and now we are ready to have a physical revolution, that we can reinvent what pain means while we are working, what assisted living means, what getting older and preserving your mobility could look like. You could not even find enough information to fill one website. It was, and you go on LinkedIn 10 years ago, in 3 minutes, you would have been done with every single post that was posted about this type of technology for the week. Now you have to be on LinkedIn every 3 minutes just to keep up. We definitely have the communication going. Karl, you've been a part of that. I truly enjoy your daily or near daily LinkedIn posts because I don't keep up with all of the research side and research developments. And then I think ChatGPT obviously is also helping. So Karl will look through a paper, has his own conclusions. I will skim the paper or read the paper, then ask ChatGPT questions like, what did I miss? Why do they do this that way? What are they talking about here or there? So I try never to copy paste Karl's conclusions, but it's definitely helpful to have more people talking and discussing this. I've seen also another change that makes me happy. Before, it was always about the hype of the next gadget. So there'll be a new exoskeleton, and like CNET, when they started getting interested, or other organizations will go in, do a video, hype it up, and it gets like 1.5 million views. And now people have wisened up. Those same videos will get 100,000 views at best. Where we are done with that phase. We are done with the sensationalization and the hype of the new device and the new exoskeleton and the new exosuit. Now we are moving into, well, what can it do for me? Where is it being applied? How can you make me trust this thing to try it out? And Karl, it was actually the webinar that you led for the National Safety Council a few months ago. You had a speaker there that said, what is the big T? Is it technology or is it trust?
Yeah.
And that we are transitioning from the technology side to getting people now to trust this enough in order to give it a shot. And
Exactly.
to apply it. And I'm like, yes, I really like the way that they put it. Like, what is the next big T? So
Yep.
it doesn't mean that exoskeleton technology will go stagnant. Quite the opposite. It will continue to improve and to innovate, and more people are becoming accessible for less. But I'm seeing a change where the narrative is now shifting to, we have crossed over the technology threshold where this can clearly become applicable to many use cases. And now we need to explain to people what is it that we are trying to achieve and why, with so many competing other promises from solution providers, they should give this a try.
Yep. I like the calling out of the trust in technology. The thing I realized is for any new technology that is crossing that chasm or going across the technology adoption cycle, when you're at the like innovator or early adopter stage, it really is about the technology. That's what draws people in. But to cross into the early majority, like trust is the key thing. That is part of how you can tell if any new technology is starting to cross that chasm. And I'm pretty optimistic and encouraged by the signs and trends that I've been seeing. Also, thanks for engaging with the content I put up on LinkedIn and kind of on the science blog that I keep, I probably read more of the articles from academia and in industry than anyone else, and I can't keep up. I mean, you quite literally would have to quit your job at this point and just focus on it. And I benefited a lot from others, including yourself, sharing information and consolidating, summarizing that information, and drawing attention to really the key milestones and insights. So I'm happy to contribute to that environment. I'm big on science communication, and I learned in this field, and this goes back to 10 years ago. I was frustrated that I felt like a lot of the content online was, even though there wasn't much of it still was myths and misconceptions and hype and Hollywood. And it felt like one option was I could gripe about it, or I could try to contribute positively and add my voice and encourage others to. So, Bob, you've been a trailblazer with this. You've been, again, just like I was kind of singing praises with Tom, like you've been an outsized figure in this field, and the communication, I think the accumulation of good information online has a snowball effect where we're seeing more and more good content, more grounded information, less hype, less myths and misconceptions. They still persist to some degree, but it's definitely a lot better than it was 5 or 10 years ago.
Yeah, I want to go down two paths here for a second, Bobby, if you don't mind. To ask Karl, you used to post myths about exoskeletons and misconceptions, and you had and you even gave a talk at WearCon, and it was fantastic. And so, could you talk about? I want to try to talk about a couple myths, but make it go into a positive mode. So what is like one of the myths that really has frustrated you that got into the, ecosphere or whatever we want to call it? But then now, as you said, then move into this, talk to us about some of the data that you're seeing that says, okay, here's long-term, like that was always the thing. I want to see some long-term data, some long-term evidence that this is helping people, right?
Yeah.
Maybe give us two pieces there,
I can't limit myself to two, but I love this question. And I will say it's gotten to the point where I've actually had to separate the old myths from the new myths.
Okay.
And that's progress, because I don't hear the old myths.
Good.
So the old myth,
a new myth then.
yeah, the old myths, 5, 10 years ago were things like, oh, exos are going to cause muscle atrophy or deconditioning. Never been any evidence of that. And the deeper I've delved into muscle physiology and all the industrial evidence, there's just simply no evidence of it. But you don't hear it as much as you used to, because there's more evidence out there, and there's more experts that have come to the same conclusion. Other old myths are things like exos are heavy and bulky, high-tech robotic devices. Of course, they can be, but exos is much like the term vehicle or tool. It encompasses a huge variety of things. So I don't hear that myth quite as much anymore. Some people, exos give you superhuman strength was one, right? The Hollywood version, that's one extreme. The other extreme was exos are only for people with disabilities, right? And as exos have become more prevalent in society, recreationally, occupationally, that myth has also kind of faded. Another myth that did kind of irk me was, oh, exoskeletons just transfer force from one part of the body to another. Told me as a biomechanist, is I'm like, that's not how physics works. Like, and I've given a number of talks where I break down in very simple descriptions, like this is actually what's happening, and it's not just a simple transfer of one force to another. You can actually unload one part of the body, a targeted offloading, without increasing risk in other places. And then there's always kind of old myths around, like, either powered exos assist more than passive ones, or vice versa, and it's often just kind of misleading marketing or faulty assumptions. And the reality is it always depends, and there's a lot of factors and variables, as you all know. So those are old myths, but I don't find myself answering those questions as much. I posted about them in the past. I have articles I've written, including I think one with you, Bobby, about muscle atrophy and what's the evidence behind that. But I'm drawn more to the new myths now. And again, this is progress in the field, because people aren't getting caught up on some of the fundamentals. So the new myths are things like, I will sometimes hear people say, all right, I hear about these exoskeletons for the workplace, but there's just no longitudinal data on long-term injury impacts. And I'm like, yeah, you're right. I mean, there's just no data except for Toyota and Ford and Boeing and Wegmans and URM and hundreds of thousands of hours of aggregated injury data. Like, it's gotten to the point where there is a bit of a disconnect where people think there's no information out there. And I'm like, there's a massive corpus of data out there now, in many cases that exceeds the data that exists, longitudinal data that exists in the public domain for other kind of tried and true traditional ergonomic controls. And so, yeah, the no longitudinal data one is a new myth. The exos are too expensive to gain widespread adoption is another one. And we can dig into this here, but I think the key unlock for me and where I think this myth really falls apart is people talk about cost, but that is the wrong thing to focus on. You have to talk about return on investment. That is what people ultimately care about, at least in the workplace. They're going to evaluate what am I gaining? What's the financial upside relative to the cost? And the trap you can fall into is as somebody who has spent their entire career working on wearable assistive devices to help people with disabilities or to help reduce disabilities and injuries in society, the goal has never been minimal impact at minimal price, right? It's never been let's eke out and make this thing as cheap as possible and do it at least as possible. The key is, are you driving return on investment? And I will say the last year has been really eye-opening for me, the last year or two, where I've kind of gone deep on ROI calculators and collecting and accumulating data from industry. And I'm now at the stage, I mean, it took me a long time to get here, but I am confident that exoskeletons, at least the exosuits that we've been deploying, are delivering 5 to 10x ROI for good use cases. Confidently saying that repeatably and across multiple clients. And it's taken a long time for the field to get there. It's taken the full 10 years. It's only been in the last couple of years. But again, this idea that exoskeletons are too expensive is missing an understanding of value proposition, is missing an understanding of business, is missing an understanding of return on investment. And just a couple of other ones. The other new myths I would say are things like exos have poor user acceptance. I think that's one that historically that has been a challenge. But at this stage, again, I would say well-designed, properly fit, comfortable exos, we regularly see user acceptance rates of 70 or 80%, which is quite remarkable relative to most safety technologies and even some other tools. So I think that's, again, kind of a myth where people are leveraging old, out-of-date information, but actually don't realize how much the field has evolved and advanced. And then finally, there's I think, ongoing myths around, there's no long-term users or companies that are using exos at scale. I can tell you I know of multiple exoskeleton or multiple companies that have fully deployed exoskeletons across their organization for certain job types, that are using exoskeletons today as standard equipment, that are mandating exoskeletons for new hires. Like, again, not all of this stuff is public, not all of it can be public, but the field has advanced the kind of corpus of data on long-term injury impacts, productivity impacts, business impacts, ROI, long-term use is really exploded in a way that we always dreamed of, but it's just kind of materialized, I'd say, in the last couple of years. So those are more of the new myths, and they relate to the size and scale and impact in the real world.
I have 2 follow-up questions, Bob, if you let me go. One is, do we need to create a white paper or a website that aggregates some of this data? Because I don't think I even know all the data that's out there. And so this is for the audience. Bobby and I keep saying to everyone, we would love to get, success stories. We're not calling them case studies because I don't want to have a journal paper, because people are going to read a journal paper, but I want success stories. Exactly what you just said, Karl. Like, such and such a company has deployed an exoskeleton across 500 people for 3 years. And the problem is we haven't been able, and so I'm there's a lot of questions there, Karl, but the problem is we haven't been able to get people to tell us that, right? They don't want to put that down on paper. And it gets back to, and I know we all know, like, it gets back to some of the companies, they don't want to publish the data, right? They don't want to publish the workers' comp data. They don't want to, they're a bit nervous on it, but it's just like, we need some people, like, we have the stories, but we don't have as much data as I think we want, where, hey, this made a big difference at a car company. Boo, 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 boo. Just using that general thing. Hey, this made a big difference at a logistics site for in a supermarket, for a grocery company. Da 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 da. Here's the data. Anyway, any thoughts? I probably have
Lots of thoughts on this. You're absolutely right. I think the field needs to be able to tell more of these success stories. The reality is, any success stories you know of, the ones that are in the public domain, right, they're the tip of the iceberg. And the reason is that certainly exoskeleton researchers, exoskeleton developers would love to tell these stories, but the stories belong to the companies. Many of these are large corporations who have their own rules, regulations, and protocols for sharing this type of information. Certainly are not going to overshare things like workers' compensation, financial information, but even companies that have been successfully using and scaling exos for years may, for various reasons, not be in a position to come out and share that information. The manager or safety manager overseeing the project might actually want to share it publicly, but say, hey, our corporate communications office won't allow this. So I think that is the challenge that the field wrestles with, but it's not unique to us. Any B2B technology that is new is going to encounter this same challenge. And you see progress. I mean, 3-4 years ago, there were only a few names that any of us would mention related to real long-term exoskeleton data, right? We talk about maybe Toyota, Ford, GM, maybe Boeing. I mean, I could count on one hand the number of companies that would come out and say anything. But I suppose 2 points. One is, in the last few years, there have been an increasing number of companies coming out and sharing success stories, sharing deployments of a large number of exos across their organization, across multiple sites, sharing data on reductions in injury, sharing data on productivity. And there are more companies coming out there and talking about it. It's still only the tip of the iceberg, but we are seeing that progress. And I haven't tracked it closely, but I bet every year there's twice as many companies that come out and share their data. I know HeroWear led a panel at ProMat earlier this year where it had 3 or 4 clients come out, named clients with their own data, sharing longitudinal data on productivity impacts, on retention, on impacts on long-term injuries. And we've seen dramatic decreases in back injuries and overall in musculoskeletal strains and sprains. And I think the key thing that the field needs to do is to keep amplifying these success stories, amplify users, not just products, right?
Yes.
Have to get better at telling those stories. The field as a whole, though, the exoskeleton field, at least on the occupational side, is limited in the number of stories it can tell. Now, there are other things that happen behind the scenes. Sometimes companies might get connected with peer companies where they can hear the stories and hear the data. So don't think that the success stories aren't being shared. It's just they can't always be shared publicly. But sometimes it is safety manager to safety manager or company to company. They can exchange notes. There's a lot more data out there, but even the data that's in the public domain has grown by orders of magnitude. So I think we've got to do a better job telling those stories. And really, I think we've got to do a better job telling the business story, this value proposition, this ROI. I'm a researcher, I'm an engineer by training, but I have come to learn and appreciate the importance of being able to convey, not in a hand-wavy fashion, not qualitatively, not with weird apples to oranges comparisons, but convey the value in a way that actually means something to a finance person, to an operations person. And I think the field is just getting to that point, I'd say within the last year or so. And that is part of what's changing the perception of exos from, I would say, a technological curiosity to an actual business advantage, to an actual compelling value proposition. And that is, it's probably taken us too long to get there. But I'd say the storytelling and amplifying users and the ability to communicate the business value are huge areas where the exoskeleton field can improve, are probably areas that I've been irked by and frustrated by over the years. And then also just candid, authentic communication. Like it still isn't a new technology. We're still figuring a lot of things out. Some of the benefits are starting to crystallize for certain industries. And there's others that are still exploratory, and we can and should be honest about that. And that's an opportunity and a benefit. But if we can get this right, and I think the field is on the right trajectory, we have the potential to improve a lot of lives. We have the potential to benefit a lot of organizations. And so it's worth the effort. And, for me, it's worth like reinventing yourself from a scientist to an engineer to understanding enough about business that you can help connect the dots, that you can help advocate. And I think we're on a good trajectory, but we got to find a way to tell those stories. To your point, maybe a website or a place to accumulate that information is a good idea. I'm not quite sure what the right platform is to share that, but podcasts, anytime I get to write a trade article, anytime I get to share a presentation, I like to touch on these things to try to help people understand the amount of evidence that's been built, what we've learned over the last 10 years, and what we're still figuring out.
Yeah, and I've always called it an applications vault. So when I was in industry for an unrelated company, they had a separate department, which was not part of manufacturing and it was not part of research and development. It was the applications department. And they had a separate website where you go in and they had 700 use cases where the customers have been willing to share how they bought the product, how they applied it, how they're using it, and what are the results that they're expecting to get out of it. So you go in there and, like, for example, you have an oil spill and you just type in oil spill and you see for this type of oil, we use this equipment, we set up the test run this way, and then this is how to interpret the results. And it's a separate entity from the marketing department. So that's always been a dream for me, for us to have an applications vault where you don't lead with the technology. As most people don't know I want passive back support exo. Now it's like, I'm a roofer is what they're going to look. And then they'll be like, okay, I'm a roofer and I specialize, like, let's say in consumer sites or regular housing, 45-degree, 30-degree average slope for the roof versus commercial sites that have flat roofs. And then it will tell you, okay, these are the injuries that we're seeing in your profession, and then these are the exoskeletons and exosuits that could apply to you. So that remains a dream of mine. We also, I don't think we have built a marketplace yet where a person can go and compare exoskeletons easily and have a compare tool, the way that you would buy a car or the way that you would buy a camera. But I want to go back to, like, what has changed over the last 10 years. I think when I got started, there were like all of these myths that exoskeletons will copy my movements and then the company will replace me because they now know all the tricks as to how I do the job, and the exoskeleton has copied everything that I know and I'm going to be replaced. So I'm happy to see that disappear. I think we have seen a lot of, like, misconceptions as to what this is. I'm also happy to see over engineering disappear. A lot of the earlier devices were simply over engineered. Too many clasps, safety factors sky high. Like, you had shoulder support exoskeletons that could basically stop a bullet, where something that could be a plastic clip at the time was a heavy steel blade with double or triple clasp. I think, unfortunately,
tap on that, and you can continue, but just a double tap on that. You know, this field came out of a lot of scientists and engineers, and being one of them, I can tell you we do have a tendency to overcomplicate things, and so I've realized over the years that's a little bit baked into the ethos of this field, and we had to learn that it's okay to simplify things. It's okay for things not to have the flash or the gadgetry or the novelty that sometimes is really important for securing, let's say, grant funding or resources on the academic side, but to really marry the user needs and sophistication. And that goes for the technology, that also goes for other aspects. But I'll let you get back to it. And I just say, like, that's a little bit baked into us, and all of us, myself included, have to fight against that urge to make everything more complicated than it needs to be.
And then similar, you have definitely worked on return on investment calculators. I completely agree with you that this cost has been a myth. I've worked in industry. I have seen the amount of money that is spent on ideas. Cost is not the limiting factor with exoskeletons anymore. I cannot agree more with you. I'm really glad that you brought it up. But trust, fear, and understanding of return on investment are, I think, the new frontier.
Yeah.
Especially corporate America right now is very much risk averse, where the first question is, what potential harm can this do? And then look at, okay, well, how can we profit from it? And I think without having information consolidated in one place. It's still a little bit difficult for like a manufacturing engineer or a safety person who might have no engineering background. They could be coming like a retired nurse who's now in charge of health and safety at a production plant. I'm not quite sure that we've given them all the tools that they would need to feel that they're in charge of the selection process. And for me, it always remains a challenge on the communication side when it comes to torque and moment. I wish that that was mandatory to be taught in school. It's not a linear transfer of force. It's a moment. If you shorten or lengthen the moment arm, you will change the total forces that you're seeing. And I think that's where a lot of the times the conversation around exoskeleton struggles. It's not explaining exoskeletons, but it's explaining what a moment arm is.
Yeah. I think that's changing. I think that's becoming less important. Look, that was a really important topic that we had to broach in the earliest days of the exoskeleton field because there was no long-term data on injury impacts, on productivity, on ROI. And so you had to explain the science, right? And I may be uniquely positioned to speak on this because as a researcher who did some of the early work on how exos affect muscle activity, and I love talking about biomechanics and torque and forces. And in the earliest days, I would be called into meetings, including with sales meetings, to talk to safety managers, talk to ergonomists, to talk to folks that were really trying to understand what is this new technology and how is it going to affect people. How many of those calls do you think I get called into now? Like how often do you think I get looped into those calls now? Almost never. Almost never. Why? Because we don't talk in terms of torque anymore. We talk in terms of, hey, we've got multiple other clients that do a very similar job to you. They've been using it at scale for this number of years, for this number of employees. They're seeing this much reduction in injury. They're seeing this boost in productivity sustained over a year, over 2 years, right? And I think this is the transition and the change where you don't have to have everyone understand those anymore. You start to have a database where you say, hey, we have enough use cases that are like yours, and it's repeatable. We know how to roll this out. We know what to expect. And where I started getting more and more confidence is where we started running these longer term field trials or pilots, and you could literally predict the results before they came back. Like, we have enough survey data. We've done this enough times. Your result in terms of injury reduction, in terms of worker reported improvements in comfort, in terms of productivity, it's going to be in this band. And with high confidence, as you accumulate that data over time, you start to be able to predict those. And once you're able to tell that story, and not just a story, I mean a data-driven story, once you're able to provide that evidence, it changes the conversation. And so I'm still a biomechanist. I still like talking about torque and moments, and I get thrilled anytime. I mean, occasionally there is an ergonomist who says, hey, we want to understand how to integrate exoskeletons into our ergonomic tools. We use this particular set of assessments. And I love those conversations. I get those calls less and less frequently. And that is a sign of progress. That is a sign of having real world data. And it's also a sign of reality, which is there isn't a company out there that is sitting on the sidelines going, oh, I'm thinking about buying some exosuits for my employees, but I'm just waiting for Vanderbilt to publish one more study on it. Like, there's nobody sitting around waiting for this stuff. They are looking for peers. They are looking for relevant data. They are looking for success stories. They are looking for evidence to say, hey, we can trust this data if you can show us, or we can trust this technology, right? If you can show us repeatable data that is similar to our use case, and we have confidence that we can see similar results, right? That's the difference between innovators and early adopters versus the early majority. The early majority is waiting for that kind of clear, proven, repeatable ROI. They're waiting for standardized products. They're waiting for a track record of success. And I see that change happening, much to my chagrin, because I'm not getting called into as many meetings to talk to people, but that's the trend. That's what's happening. And I think that's part of what has me encouraged about the future and the trajectory of the field.
I wholeheartedly completely agree. Let me put some thoughts, and it's related, I think, to Bobby a little bit. I put out to the community, I think what Karl was just saying is extremely important. And I put out to the community that that's what I think we need to do. We need to focus not on early adopters anymore, but this early majority. And to get at the early majority, I think we need to develop, I don't know how to do it yet, but develop places like Exoskeleton Report where you have a section there that literally, the community says, okay, we're all gonna pay for a website that has this applications vault, this applications data. Because a long time ago, I'm just putting things out there, a long time ago, we helped to start the automobile exoskeleton group. And the idea was there's no secrets in safety. That was actually the mean line, right? We said no secrets in safety. Everyone can have their secrets on how they build the car, their secrets on their production, their quality, those type of things, but no secrets in safety. And I put out to the community again, a second thing, which is if anyone wants to jump on the podcast and talk about success stories, please come. I also put out to the community, and I think, Karl, maybe we could talk offline on this at some point, that maybe we just do, and it doesn't have to be a face-to-face, but maybe we do a exoskeleton report, Wearacon, a Fraunhofer Institute, a 3-hour webinar. I know you're doing this with the National Safety Council, where we get safety professionals to talk. And again, this idea, no secrets in safety. And because I do know companies don't want to write official papers, don't want to write conference papers, don't want to have an official PowerPoint presentation, because we talked about this with the Wearacons, but they're willing to get on and do a panel discussion or something like that. So anyway, I throw those things out there as I'm listening to Bobby and Karl. It's like, how do we move the industry from the technology or early adopters to now this, mature area where we're building. And I think that was one of the things that I wanted to get into. We were talking about what are we frustrated about it. And I think I was frustrated that we haven't been able to put together, a solid, I don't know what you want to call it, you could call it trade organization, you could call it a safety group, anyway. But how do we push this forward? And I'm enjoying this conversation greatly.
It's a great call to action. And I think I've stewed on this a lot over the years as well, as to how do we do that? Is it even the right thing to do? Is it necessary? Part of where I come down is recognizing, again, this kind of iceberg effect where collectively across the field, we can probably only talk about 10% of the success cases, right? And of no, it's just outside your control when it's up to the clients, and many of these are large corporations. It's up to them when they want to talk. And
right.
Unlike researchers where, we might run a study and be ready to share it. We'll take a long time analyzing, writing up the study, but when we're ready to share it, we'll share it. Some companies may want to wait years. So, they will align their public communication with what's right for their business. Other companies see this as a competitive advantage. They don't want to go and tell all their peers that they implemented exosuits and they're seeing a 10% productivity boost and their workers are happier. It is literally a benefit for them in terms of recruitment and their bottom line. I mean, and so you're going to have a whole variety, but you are seeing more companies coming out and talking about it. And, part of my feeling is we as researchers, we as developers, we as implementers of this technology, speaking broadly across the field, if we do our jobs well, and we do right by the workers and the organizations, and we support them and they see success, the more that grows, there's still going to be that 10%, right? So the 10% that can talk gets bigger and bigger, and they do come out and share things. And we've seen that. We've seen them come out and share specific numbers on productivity and injury impacts. We've also seen companies who said, look, we can't put our name on this. We can't tell you what our injury rate was and what it dropped to. But what we can do is we can give you permission to aggregate that across other sites, right? That's how we did our long-term injury study, whatever, late last year in 2024, is we got companies who did not have permission to publicly share all of their financial and historical injury data, but were able to share it with us in a form and give us permission to de-identify it and learn from it. And so those are the venues that I see. Is one, let's keep building the long-term evidence. Where we can, let's aggregate it and de-identify it and learn from it collectively. And where we have case studies where companies, for whatever reason, say, hey, we can share this, we want to share this, we want to highlight this, then we amplify those voices as well. Trying to bring it together systematically has been tough because you generally can't predict who the 10% are. In fact, there were times that surprised me where I assumed a company would not be willing to share something. Asked them on a whim, and they were able to share more than I ever expected. And there were other times where I thought surely they can share this information, but because of policies, procedures, or what have you, they weren't able to. So part of me just kind of feels like this problem works itself out if we do, the blocking and tackling correctly, right? And when I look over the last 10 years at the progression, we've progressed from asking things like, do exos work, biomechanically in the lab, to like, can they work in the field, to, are they acceptable to workers, to, and we build up and we systematically and rigorously answer these questions. And it's hard to talk at the 10,000 foot level since exo means many different things, but there are examples and there's good evidence that we can design and deploy devices that are acceptable to workers, that reduce physical strain, that increase endurance, that help users feel better at the end of the day, that increase productivity or quality of work. We do have large-scale long-term users now. We do have, I think, a strong initial set of evidence that these devices are reducing injuries in multiple long-term studies from multiple different named clients, shoulder, back, different products. Like we have that evidence. And I think what we're building up now is the evidence on really strong ROI. But we're building these, and the more we build it, the more, companies will come out and share. But it's hard to systematize and it's hard to pull the information. I'm encouraged by the fact that each year it seems like more companies are coming out and sharing, and more companies that see other companies sharing. Like it's a flywheel, and it's happening, it's working. And I kind of wrestle between this, like, oh, do we need to set up a structure and a venue, or do we just need to keep blocking and tackling and make sure we get the business model and the business case right? And this will work itself out. I think it's working right now.
I want to continue on the topic, if that's okay, Tom,
Please.
with how things have changed over the last 10 years. So I'm seeing now, I think I'm seeing a split in the community if occupational exoskeletons in general will be apply and sink and swim, like a pair of safety glasses, where you buy a bunch of safety glasses, you bring it to the floor, let the people choose. Or are we going to go down the how should I say it, the implementer route, where you will always have to have some level of training, which is very common, more common, I think, than people realize. Respirator technology is done that way. You do not randomly buy respirators. You have to write a respiratory protection program. You have to go through your hierarchy of controls. You have third-party independent testing and verification. Same thing is done with automation. No internal team is expected to know what is the latest and greatest in automation. You have implementers that will come to the site, and they will come up with packages based on your needs, and they will stay with you through the initial prototypes, the initial training, and depending on your contract, through mass implementation and support. So you're in the middle of this, Karl. Where do you see this? Which way are we going to go?
Well, I've given a talk about this in the past. I think this is relevant, but occupational exos are very much a product and a service right now. They're not just a hardware product. I think that's something that the field didn't appreciate and didn't excel on early on, 10 years ago. And maybe that was normal. Maybe that was just the natural progression, right? It went from, the science, but science isn't a product. And then we built out these capabilities, but that's still not a product. And then there were prototypes, still not a product. And then there were, generation 1 exoskeletons that were products, but there was still learning that had to be done in the real world to get them to be scalable products. And part of that learning is that exos are a product and a service. If you want to, truly derive the value and get the ROI. Your question around, I guess, integrators, there's different forms of integrators. There's, HeroWear has an implementation team, implementation specialists that help companies integrate. Ultimately, this is technology that a company is purchasing. They have to take ownership of. They have to have the management support. They have to have the oversight and run it. But, there's an internal implementation specialist team. There are also third-party implementation specialists. There are some distributors or partners that provide that type of service. Let's say if they're distributing in a different geographic region. But, for me, for the foreseeable future, exoskeletons are a product and a service. Exactly how you operationalize that can vary, and how it's going to look 10 or 20 years from now, that's probably not something I've spent quite as much time thinking about. I've thought about the different possible ways that it could go, but I think that's far enough out that there's a few potential futures. But what I'll say right now is, exos are definitely a product and a service. And the good news is, again, for the business case perspective, those can be justified, and it's an industrial tool. This isn't a consumer one-off purchase. This is like every other tool or piece of safety tech that companies have, is they have policies and protocols around it. They train their workers on how to use tools properly. So this isn't a foreign concept. It may be different than what people know about, especially coming from academia, or if you're coming from a background where you don't really understand, business to business sales or how industry works. But I think this is just very common and standard. And I think sometimes maybe from a technical or overly academic perspective, we have maybe a false impression of how all of this works together. I think that exoskeletons are being deployed and implemented in a very similar way to many other safety technologies and industrial tools.
Yeah, thanks for that. I'm very good to hear from you. We'll see. I think that's something that's been developing over the last decade, where definitely I think we started as a plug and play technology, specifically at least for the industrial side. For the medical side, there's always going to be an element of training. And we had speakers talk about that, about standardizing all of these things, to trying to find ways to streamline it. And your input, I'm with you on that. I think we're going to see, and we are seeing less and less of this idea that exoskeletons have to be plug and play out of the box. Maybe on the consumer side, that will stay the case. And then the other thing,
the business model. So yeah, it can be different in medical. It may be different in recreational, but in the occupational realm, it's going to be a product and a service. I also think that, if you look far enough out, go 30 years in the future, and if exoskeletons do become standard common tools in certain jobs, and everyone that goes into that job uses it, at some point it's going to become so common, we might not even call them exoskeletons. It's just a normal piece of gear you wear for this job. And yes, it may get to the point where you don't really need training because everyone's tied their shoes before. Everyone in this industry has put on a fall protection harness before, or whatever the case is, where the training is minimal to none. But that's almost like a generational leap. And again, going back to my point earlier, is let's get the fundamentals right. Let's build the success cases. Let's do right by end users. And that type of thing works itself out. But let's not delude ourselves into thinking that that's going to happen next year or the year after, no matter what we do. Like it's not going to change. This is a new technology. This is an industrial technology. These are serious workplaces. Training and implementation are absolutely critical.
And the last thing on my mind that's bubbling up for like what's changed in the last 10 years is where government institutions fall into the equation. So obviously in the beginning, this was too little in order to like really require too much involvement. But we're seeing now, for the first time, interesting stories coming out of Japan, where the Exosuit Association, which is their occupational exoskeleton like alliance group, and not every single Japanese exo manufacturer is part of that. They're able to organize meetings with ministers and have reports and get communication between departments. We are seeing a little bit of information trickling from West Europe too, where big insurers, governments are taking interest. We've seen just recently President Macron be with Wondercraft and labeling them as an AI company, and that they need to have investment and be highlighted as a made in France AI company. And I've talked to people over the years too that have told me that we are doing it backwards, that we need to start with government and then work our way up.
Yeah.
So I think I've seen a lot of there was like I think a year ago there was a report to the Senate on exoskeletons and exosuits. Not entirely sure where that has landed. How do the two of you see government and communication with government institutions in North America, at least?
Yeah. Well, maybe Tom, I'll jump in first, and then I'd love to hear your thoughts. I have a lot of thoughts on this topic, and I think one of the things that's really fun about this field, and maybe any emerging technology, is right. We're all trying to both figure out the future and also strategize on what's the right way to get there. And you have legitimate, healthy, interesting, different perspectives on like, oh, I think we should be doing it this way. I think we should be doing it that way. And I think that's fun. I find that invigorating. I think the kind of wrestling of ideas is great. From my vantage point, I think there's multiple ways to bright. There's multiple ways that exos take off. And, if resources and time are not bandwidth limiting, then let's do all of them, right? Let's explore, right? But, for each one of us individually, there is very much bandwidth limits on where you can put your time and energy. And you have to decide, what are the things that you can impact and how do you think the field is going to evolve? You can look at many different safety technologies, and it is true that once government bodies get involved, regulatory policies or changes can make industries, full stop, right? Whether that's requiring fall protection or whether that's adding, machine guards or anti-lock brakes or seat belts, like it does make a change. But the key questions to ask are like, how long will that take? And is it under your control to impact? Like what can you realistically impact within a certain time frame, right? And I think I'm pretty pragmatic about these things. I do think there is a likely future where exoskeletons become, the evidence continues to accumulate. We already talked about some long-term impacts on injuries, that it accumulates to the point where there become regulations that for certain types of jobs, in order to keep people safe, that these are a required safety tool. I think that is a likely future, but I'm also a big believer in learning from the past. So I'm going to quiz you two. I actually did a little bit of research before coming into this, and what I want to quiz you on is I just let me give a little more context here. I sometimes hear people talk about exoskeletons and they ask questions like, well, why haven't exoskeletons been adopted faster? Why aren't there more of them out there? Why, whatever, why aren't insurance companies subsidizing these? Why aren't there regulations? And I found myself struggling with this because I don't remember anyone ever writing down 5 or 10 years ago, like, oh, this is how fast we think the exoskeleton field is going to grow. And there always seem to be these questions of like, well, why not more? Why not faster? Why not more widespread? And I thought, well, surely there are other technologies that are out there that we can learn from, whether those are safety technologies or tools. I just need 1 second to pull up this spreadsheet to kind of effectively quiz you on this. But the question was like, well, how long does it take? And where this fits with regulatory is, some of these technologies were slowly, gradually adopted, and then they kind of hit a big spike once regulations kicked in. But like, how long does it take, right? Is the general framework in the game we're going to play? And I looked up some mainstream technologies, and I looked up some industrial safety technologies and tools. All right. So what I'm
And real quick, we're completely blindsided by this. We have not discussed that we'll be doing this. Let's do it.
I sprung this on you. This is on the spot.
Your C's.
So in the way I frame this to try to add parity, and I can give some context on regulatory stuff, but with any new technology, there's the innovator stage of adoption where people are first starting to deploy it and explore it. Those are the tech folks that really want to try the newest thing. And then there's when you enter the early majority, right? So like, how long does it take for any new technology, and specifically hardware technologies, industrial technologies, business to business technologies? I'm not talking about an app going viral. I'm not talking about Candy Crush. I'm talking about industrial technology. So maybe we'll start with fall protection, because clearly that was one that was largely impacted by OSHA regulations. What was the time it took to go from innovator stage to early majority? This isn't to say everyone has it, just early majority. You're starting to get into the meat of people that trust a technology being proven. How long did that take?
Are you gonna tell us an answer like it started in 1940 and ended in 1960 or something?
I can give you dates. I was planning to just give you the time duration.
Okay, sure. Fall prevention.
Yeah, how long did it take from early innovators, people that were starting to deploy it and use it in work sites, to when the early majority started to adopt this at scale?
I guess I hope, like, I'm just thinking like climbing ladders. I mean, it's probably worse than I think, but I'm gonna go 18 years, I guess. 15 to 18 years. 15,
Yeah, I'm not sure how you're framing this. I want to have a guess too. I would say 4,000 years because we've got rope technology.
No, okay, yeah, you can cheat by doing invention. This isn't time of invention. This is like when people started legitimately using it in the workplace as early innovators. In the same way, okay, if we're talking about exoskeletons, you could say, oh, somebody invented something that was exoskeleton like 100 years ago, so it took 120 years. It's not playing that game. It's like, okay, when did people really start using exoskeletons in the workplace? I would say probably the 2010s is when you would say that would be like the innovator phase. Some people are really starting to use it. So it's not invention too early majority. It's innovator adoption into the real world.
or you're kind of saying people using it in
Well, it's not 4,000 years. It's not 4,000.
right? Because
Right, so I know the Golden Gate Bridge was built with no safety harnesses, no safety protection. Now you go to pick up a piece of furniture, you will see people wearing fall protection harnesses when they come to deliver the stuff to you. So from that logic, I'd say 80 years then.
How long? 80?
Yes.
Okay, it's kind of in between the two of you, depending on where you count. 40 to 70 years is about what it took. 40 to 70. Let's see. I'll maybe just ask you one or two more, and then I'll rattle off some others. What about, I don't know, seatbelts?
Oh, that's
so seatbelt. So I can say I was in a station wagon in the 1970s, and we could care less about seatbelts. There was 5 kids in the back of a station wagon waiting, and you didn't care, and there were metal dashboards,
Yeah.
right? So you would have whacked your head. So
And I grew up in East Europe where like the seat belt still had like the original oil from installation because in 30 years they have not been used once.
all right, but still, I would probably say seatbelts became what mandatory, right? Because you would get a ticket. You would get a. Is that where we're kind of getting at? Like you would get a. You.
Well, this is where the regulatory comes in, is like some of these technologies were definitely influenced by federal or state policies, right? But early majority doesn't mean mandatory. It doesn't mean everyone's using it. There's still late majority. There's still the laggards. It just means like, when did, the
Yeah, I'd say by 2000 you had to. I think there were seatbelt regulations 2000. So I'd say 30 years for that one.
I'd say 60 because like going from like the Model T to you, 50% of the cars would have some sort of a seat belt.
Okay, y'all are in the right ballpark. And let me preface this all by saying I pulled together some research, using some large language models. I did some spot checking, and so these aren't perfect, and it's hard to say exactly when one moment is. But seatbelts probably 20 to 40 years, influenced by National Traffic and Motor Safety Act. Airbags 20 to 50 years, anti-lock brakes somewhere between 20 and 70. Machine guards, so for industrial equipment 40 years. Safety light curtains 30 to 50 years. Lockout tagout. Do you know what lockout tagout is? When you have a valve and it needs to be repaired or inspected, and you lock it and you tag it, right?
Yep.
Not much simpler than that. That's not high tech. That's a piece of plastic that's red, and that's a lock. Lockout tagout. How long did that take to go from early innovator to the majority of people being like, yeah, that's a great idea, when safety is really on the line, and I've got some chemical valve or high pressure air or whatever the case is that like needs to be inspected so that we don't seriously hurt or kill someone. How long did it take for that to go? Innovator.
Well, I mean, when I was in manufacturing, we had to do lockout safety for rolling equipment and things, and that we were doing lockout safety in 91. So I don't know, maybe they weren't doing it in the 40s. But we were doing it in the 90s, so 50 years.
Okay, well, maybe this one goes back further. My research showed 10 to 20 years, which was pretty quick for adoption of.
Yeah, that is pretty quick, come to think of it.
But that should help you level set. Like, that is a simple technology that has gone from being implemented. It's clearly a good idea, but to actually become adopted at scale just with the early majority. This isn't everyone. This isn't all the way through the technology adoption cycle. This isn't the laggards. 10 to 20 years, industrial proximity sensors, 30 to 50, lift assist devices and hoists, 20 to 40, zero gravity manipulators, 20 to 30, ergonomic pallet positioners, 20 to 30. You're starting to get the idea. And if you go over to mainstream tech, it's not much different. How long did it take for touch screens to go from early innovation stage to early majority? 20 to 25 years. Electric vehicles, 25 to 35. Tablets, 15 to 20. Bluetooth. We all love Bluetooth now. It's great. 12 to 18 years before it was actually adopted at scale by the early majority. QR codes, cloud computing, 15 years. Streaming services, 10 to 20. Okay, where all this ties into your question around, I went way far afield, but to bring us back, it takes time. It takes decades. And if you are waiting around or hoping that you're able to push and nudge and advocate for government, we should be doing this. We should be coming together as evidence-built and advocating for things that are going to improve workplace safety and health. Absolutely, we should be doing this. But I sure as heck don't want to put all my eggs in that basket. And what I'm seeing with the progress we're making in terms of demonstrating a business case, right? Like, this is the thing you can control. This is the way that you can get companies to adopt something at a big enough scale that now state and federal governments are starting to pay attention, are starting to, should we be regulating this? Insurance companies are starting to get involved. So sorry, that was pretty far afield, but it's just to say I'm all for trying to find the political support. I'm all for trying to keep the federal and state agencies involved, aware, engaged. But I also know the things we can control. I also see the trends and the ability to provide real value to businesses, to provide real safety improvements and real well-being improvements to workers. And if we can do that, hey, regulatory stuff might happen 10 years from now or 30 years from now, but it's not going to matter because we are going to be benefiting, helping people along the way. And we will get there to the point where, I'll phrase it this way, that countries and governments can decide, right? We're still early on. I can't sit here and tell you, oh, these should definitely be mandated or not. I can tell you that there are companies here and now today in 2025 that have seen enough benefits from these technologies that they have said, this is a no-brainer, we should be mandating it. It's in the best interest of our people and it's helping our business. There's a clear return on investment. We see high enough user acceptance rates. We're making the call, right? Like we've repeated the tests, we've repeated the trials across multiple sites. We've made the decision. This will now be mandatory for all new workers to help them transition, to help keep them safe, right? So again, long-winded way of saying, my perspective is let's really make sure we control and do the things within our control, and let's push on those other areas to the extent that we have bandwidth and we can. But the more evidence we build, the easier it is to then go and have, again, safety agencies or federal or state groups take a look at it and say, hey, what's in the best interest of our people?
But some thoughts that come to my mind is like things that we have control over, Bobby and I have done is like, when you were there, like the Fraunhofer Institute with their Exo Park and Exo Workathlon, and they're working directly with A+A, the largest safety conference in the world. It's about 65,000 people go to that conference, and Exo Park and an Exo Workathlon at Dusseldorf, Germany. What I like about that is that in Europe, I think they're really doing a big push in that area. Then if I look at Japan with their assist suit, so it's still a call to action. I just put out there a call to action for North America to take a look at what Europe is doing, to take a look at what Japan is doing. But, what do I have control over? It's like the A+A conference is outstanding, and the Wearicon Europe is going to...
I can't make it, but a number of my HeroWear colleagues will be there.
Good. If they can take a look at such a... I mean, this is just it's every 2 years in Europe. And so that's a great one. Bobby this is a call out for Bobby. He puts out a newsletter weekly. He puts out a podcast, and he has a catalog. So we're doing that. I just think as a community, North America needs to push a bit harder.
This is definitely a global movement, and it's been interesting to see how different geographies are leveraging it or coming it together. And certainly I think what Europe has going for it is it definitely has kind of more exoskeleton vendors. It's got, a larger population than North America, roughly twice the population of the US. and some different kind of safety culture that I think is a tailwind. Like, helps with exoskeleton adoption. I think there's certain countries that have some subsidies in place, and so there's good opportunities for growth there and kind of positive signs and trends. Where I would kind of caution is that kind of every region does things differently. The truth is in fact, almost all of the large scale longitudinal data, exemplifying exoskeleton adoption, expansion, growth, learning, societal impacts, injury, almost all of that is coming out of the US right now. I don't see that data coming out of Europe. I don't see that data coming out of Asia. Asia has, aging population, so that's kind of a tailwind or a motivator for them to explore things. They have some subsidies. They have an even larger population, across Asia. And so each geographic region, I think, has certain things that they're doing well, but also certain areas where they're not as strong as other areas. And so I'm kind of constantly trying to learn from each one and say, hey, what can we do better? And how do each of these aspects align to build up and uplift the exoskeleton field and community, ultimately to get more tools and safety technology to people that can benefit? So I see some good trends and signs in each area, but I also see some areas for improvement across each geography.
Thanks for your input. And I think that one thing I want to mention, since the focus is how things have changed in the exoskeleton field in the last 10 years, is to remind ourselves that we're not living that in a vacuum. The world is changing around us.
Yep.
So I want to do a shout out for computer aided design, for digital twins, for taking in a full simulation of work area, digitizing that with the people inside, having a digital copy of how the work is being performed, which makes it significantly easier to then investigate the in and without an exoskeleton condition, because you're already modeling the forces and the internal forces. I think we're starting to benefit from the cultural shift of robots being in a cage. So first we have the big industrial robot that always stays away from the worker. And then we started getting the idea of the cobot. So now the cages are starting to disappear. We have Amazon, where there are more robots than logistics people, and they're, in many cases, they're coexisting.
Yeah.
So the concept of putting exoskeleton onto your body, I think over the last decade, by extension from what's happening in the rest of the world, has started to become more palatable.
Yeah.
And more acceptable. My dad was completely against exoskeletons as a robotics engineer. He's like, here's one of my robots. He laid it down horizontally and he strapped me to it. And he's like, you tell me what to do and I'll move your arm with it. This is completely ridiculous and stupid. And now as he's getting older, as everyone in the company is getting older, and they can't lift pallets and they can't lift their own machines, and they're getting closer and closer to retirement, and how robots are being used everywhere in the world. His opinion on exoskeletons has really made a dramatic shift and change. And he finally...
Sorry, that's such an important call out. Please continue.
Yeah, so as we do this podcast, we try to highlight the exoskeleton technology, but the world is changing with it as well. We also having ergonomics now become more data-driven, where before it was so easy to take a look at an exoskeleton, to just dismiss it and say, well, I'm a specialist, and this is ridiculous. Versus now it's like, well, show us the data that you're making these claims. You cannot just hand wave and dismiss it anymore. We are moving into a more of a data-driven society, and that is also benefiting exoskeletons and exoskeleton technology. And as we are getting boomers and older generations getting injured, starting to get older, discovering that we've had huge leaps and bounds in digital technology, in medicine, but on the pharmaceutical side. At the end of the day, something can beep and remind you that you need to go out and walk, But seeing the success of the consumer exoskeletons and now getting to try a couple of them myself, it feels nice to have something physically help you get up that mountain trail.
Yeah.
Rather than just beep and remind you. So as we're talking about the changes that have happened over the last decade, I want to do a shout out to all the sister technology fields that are also making tremendous leaps and bounds.
Yep. Can I hop in to reemphasize that? I'm so glad you brought this up because this is a general theme with innovation. I talked earlier about some innovations like tablets and Bluetooth and QR codes and streaming services. There are reasons they didn't take off right away. Most technologies in general aren't overnight successes. If you follow the history of AI, it had its booms and its winters and its booms and its winters. And, it's often things like, hey, in the earliest efforts, the earliest generations, the earliest waves of a technology attempting to cross the chasm, maybe the user experience wasn't quite right, or there were geopolitical or cultural factors that held it back, or there were other technologies, right? Streaming services and cloud computing had to wait for some sister technologies to catch up before they made sense. You need certain amounts of bandwidth before those can come online. QR codes were buoyed by some of the things happening with COVID and just what's happening around the world. And so understanding that context, I think sometimes we make the mistake of treating exoskeletons like they're special. And in some ways they are, but in many ways they're not. Every new technology has to cross a chasm, and they are affected by either tailwinds or headwinds. And so calling out technological advances, calling out some of the societal changes, including, valuing health and safety more than certainly we did decades ago or hundreds of years ago. These are things that help the exoskeleton field. And so I see a lot of tailwinds that are kind of accelerating exoskeleton growth. They will not make exoskeletons grow on their own, but they help. Public success stories help. Those are growing. Growing long-term data, growing long-term users help. Strengthening an ROI case, a business case helps. The labor shortages, right? The aging populations, this actually helps because companies need to do more with less. Exoskeletons are certainly not the only technology being explored, but they are one way to help do more with less. Automation is increasing the output, which inevitably increases the demands on the workers that are either one process later or one process sooner. So again, that trend in increased automation actually is a tailwind for exoskeletons. Are learning how to implement exoskeletons better. There's a lot of tailwinds and things happening beyond just the exoskeleton field, just culturally in society with technologies that you have to kind of take into account with any new innovation. And so I've learned a lot from kind of taking a step back from exoskeletons, learning about other technologies and their path forward, and just saying, okay, let's pattern match. Let's recognize where we are along this progression. And by my estimates, exoskeletons are I would say probably 10, maybe 15 years along their journey from innovators, right, to, towards early majority. And, to quickly summarize the kind of quiz I gave you earlier, the mainstream technologies probably take 10 to 20 years on average. And industrial and safety technologies take a bit longer, probably 15 to 30 years. So I think I'm encouraged when I take a step back and see, hey, we're 10 to 15 years along the line. Like, we're on track with the growth you would expect for a B2B hardware technology that's impacting the world. And that's where I'm encouraged by, as you said, some of the other trends, some of the other things that are happening. But it feels like we're on track. It feels like we're in the midst of another kind of wave and another surge in this technology. And the question is, how high can it go? Nobody's been over that next peak. I think we can remain optimistic, but we're constantly solving new problems at new scales. And I think that's exciting and fun, and why many different people have different perspectives on what it is, what's going to take to get to that next peak and the next peak and the next peak. But it takes time. And I think there's a bit of a planning fallacy where people think that things happen sooner or quicker than they do. Maybe the stuff we see in the news, you see something go viral, or you see a company, a software company or something that rockets into the sky. But the reality with hardware products, the reality with the industrial space is it's about products, it's about services, and it's about timing. And a lot of the timing factors have to do with things outside the technology itself.
That was a wonderful summary. I think we talked about maybe talking about this for the last couple of minutes here, which was some tailwinds. So I think a tailwind is these consumer exos, because you're starting to see powered devices at the marketplace at $995, right? A 2-motor system at $995. And so people are willing to pay for that, right? And I think a tailwind there is an aging society. People are saying, hey, we have an older society, aging society, and hey, but I still want to go out and walk, and I still want to do, mobility is still important, right? And I know this from, and Carl knows this too, from our prosthetics and orthotics arena, working with stroke survivors, working with people with diabetes and foot neuropathies and things, that people want mobility, right? And you need mobility, right? And just imagine, we all know this, like sitting in an airplane for 12 hours and you get up after that and you're hurting, right? So imagine, if you're sitting around all the time. So people want the mobility.
Yeah, I think it's an example of a return on investment too, where the return on investment when you staying mobile, not sitting down, going out, moving, it's almost immeasurable. There's so much has been written about maintaining minimum movement in order to stay out of the hospital and to not have medical problems. And so many really circulatory systems and processes in the human body don't have their own pumps the way that the heart, so you have the cardiovascular systems, but you have other systems like the lymph system, which rely entirely on your body moving and you walking in order for fluids to be moving and discharging and going to the right places. Even the heart itself, 20% of it comes from the veins and walking and contracting your leg muscles. So it's a good example of this hidden return on investment. So I've gotten to try a few devices. More importantly, I've gotten to put it on my grandmother, who is 84 years old with significant heart problems. So she can walk, but when she exerts herself, she pays the price the next day. And so far, the thing works. We managed to get her up in the mountains in a Japanese garden that she has not been able to visit in a decade. The whole family was there. We were huffing and puffing and sweating, some huge inclines and lots of stairs. She had no problems with it, using the exo to navigate. The park, we went on this Tuesday, to our Redwoods Park, 1.5 mile walk. It doesn't sound like much, but again, with the exo, no problem. No one stopped to look at us. No one cared at all. She's also worried about how she looks. So I think the stigma is also disappearing. I'm really eager to see where this consumer market goes. Will it be a disaster like the hoverboard, where they start catching fire or public opinion turns against them? Or will it be something that becomes ubiquitous, like roller skating, or the way that it was so popular in the 2000s? Every kid had some sort of wheeled shoe.
Yeah, that's awesome that you've had that experience and been able to see generationally how it affects different people. And some of those observations are really well aligned with how I'm thinking about things, that it is going to become, exoskeletons in general are going to become more normalized in society. I'm excited about what I'm seeing with what I would call recreational or consumer exos. I think that what I see happening right now, I think, is net positive. They are definitely building awareness and visibility and interest and getting people to ask questions and getting people to consider what they think an exoskeleton is or is not. I've also tried to read a lot of or watch videos where people describe their experiences. And it's clear to me that there are at least a subset of people that are deriving some real value from these devices. And, that's kind of my core value. That's what I've spent my career doing, is trying to help improve health and mobility and independence. And so I see a lot of positives there. The one caution, and I think the risk that I see, is this wave of recreational exoskeletons is definitely leaning hard into the traditional exoskeleton playbook, which is hype, sensationalizing, being over the top, over promising, And the really critical thing is, are they able to deliver on those promises for a sufficient subset of people? There is some risk there. Again, I think it's net positive. I want to see them find their niche and their traction. But for anybody that's been in the exoskeleton field long enough, we've seen this play out and not play out well in the past. And again, not getting tunnel vision on exoskeletons. If you followed what happened with the humane AI pin kind of debacle, where they kind of raised massive amounts of money and hyped up this new technology that would sit on your lapel, and you didn't need your phone. It would project onto your hand, and you could talk to it. It was all these things. And when it got into users' hands, they were less than thrilled. And this is the risk with a lot of hype and sensationalization, is you build up an idea, you may or may not make a good first impression, but the true value of exos is always going to be, is it used in someone's life in a sustainable, long-term way? And it's too early to know with these recreational exos. If they can find the value in the right users, and I've seen enough to lead me to believe they could be on that path, but there is definitely a risk that they burn bright at the beginning and burn out if people don't continue to use them, right? This is the kind of return on investment piece, which we don't typically talk about from a personal consumer angle, but is very much there, right? If I buy something and I use it for a week or a month and it's a novelty, and then it ends up in my closet and I don't buy it again, right? Like, word gets out and you get this spike at the beginning, but this is where businesses plummet and die, right? And so I'm rooting for them. I want to see it and get the traction, because I think there are people and lives that can benefit, but I won't say it's not without risk. The way that they're going about it right now is the traditional exoskeleton playbook: hype, sensationalism. There's some risk.
Well said.
Yeah, well said. Absolutely well said. And I know where you're coming from. And there's definitely some companies, I'm not going to mention any companies, but there was some, I mean, direct names of companies, but there were some companies, I think a couple of years back, that were getting a ton of hype, like, we're a one motor, it can make you, run super fast, da 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 da. I think they're not saying those things, right? So the hype is less than. But Bobby, I'm going to let you jump in here. Where then?
Oh, the risk is.
The risk
So
is there.
we talked about, to recap, two risks. One is on safety.
Yes.
So
Bobby and I have talked.
like, let's say that these devices take off, and then suddenly everyone decides to try to catch up, or you end up with companies that have never built an exoskeleton and are just rushing through the process, and batteries start exploding, things catch fire. So there's always the risk of, which goes back to trust. Like, we have to right now, the media is viewing them positively as of recording this podcast, but we have seen that change quickly. If a news outlet thinks that they can get more clicks by criticizing technology, then they will most certainly do that.
Yeah, that's our biggest risk. And so, Bobby,
Yeah, well, I mean, and to Carl's point, that I wouldn't say one is bigger than the other. I think that they're both risk. Over promising and delivering is definitely all going into the territory of deciding to suddenly trash the competition who share the same boat as you do.
Right. But where the net positive comes for me is the motor with the the magnets, the brushless DC motor with the magnets, far out, because you want your, so I'm geeking out, but you want your R cross F to be really good. And then with a really nice, planetary gearbox in the center, and making that motor combination super cost effective. That I'm impressed with.
Yeah.
Well, you could summarize it in a different way. I think the safety that we are benefiting from advances in humanoid robotics, the robot dogs, all of these machines that require these types of high torque, low speed motors. And now we're getting a tailwind where we're getting to use them for exoskeletons.
Right. That's the deal. The risk for me, because Bobby and I have talked about this offline, which was at a very large university, because I can't speak for everyone, but at a very large university, a hoverboard burns up in a classroom, and then hoverboards are banned to be on campus, right? So, and I've seen that, personally have seen that. And so that's, some of the safety concerns, right? And things where you have certain players that want to do the right thing, building things, doing really well. But then, so let's say you have $1,000 exo that's awesome, but someone comes in and says, "Oh, I can sell something at $300."
Yeah.
Then, because I want to jump on this, marketing train, and so we'll see where things go. But
Successful will be copied, so that is going to happen, and it's certainly one of the reasons that things like safety standards are important. It's also one of the reasons that intellectual property is important, right? The reason that we file patents is not just to protect an R&D investment, but it's also to protect customers, because there are going to be cheap knockoffs. There will be devices that don't provide the same level of safety or assistance or benefits, and so that is an area that I think the entire exoskeleton field has to be vigilant of. But it's something that any new technology deals with, and it's a good problem when you're having enough success and enough benefits that there's going to be cheap knockoffs and copycats. That is a sign of success, and that is a sign of maturation. So we've got to manage it. We've got to handle it in a way that's safe, but that's ultimately where this field needs to go.
I think we've done a couple hours here, Carl.
Yeah, we've done a couple of hours tonight.
We should think about.
You like a closing or a call to?
Yeah, let's do some closing thoughts, and and we always let the guests go first, and then we usually let the guests give us some good closing thoughts. So
Okay. Yeah, I thought a little bit about a final call to action, and there's not a cohesive one because I think it depends on what group I'm talking to, and I think kind of my closing comments on this. First, phenomenal discussion. I really enjoyed it, and it's so great to get different perspectives. It's good to see where we align and places where you all have given me more to think about. But my call to actions would be, first for my academic colleagues, other researchers like myself at universities, strongly encourage you to kind of look beyond the peer-reviewed literature. There is a world of information and knowledge beyond it. Learn from industry, partner with industry, learn from people that are using exoskeletons in their daily life, or folks that have experience implementing them. And to me, that is the best way to maximize your scientific impact, because it helps ensure that you're working on grounded problems that are priorities in the field, and just really look beyond the scientific literature, learn from multiple sources. For exoskeleton developers, we've collectively built the foundation. Stay the course, keep building, build the business case, because we really do have the potential to impact a lot of lives. For exo users and companies, we talked about this, but please share your stories. This is good or bad. We need your feedback, and this is part of what it takes to move from an early adopter phase to an early majority. And so if you've used these devices, if you have experience, if you're at a company and you're able to share, please do so. And then, finally, I guess for everyone else, whether it's companies or workers, I don't know who all listens to your podcast. I certainly do. And I bet you have a diversity of different people that tune in. I would just advise, stay curious, stay up to date. I think exos have evolved tremendously in the last 10 years and moved from this kind of futuristic technology to a practical tool, and in ways that are just becoming normalized and are becoming transparent. And I mean that in a very real sense. We've been sitting here for 2 hours talking and wearing an exoskeleton the whole time, right? 10 years ago, you didn't sit around in an exoskeleton. I wear mine 1,000, 2,000 hours a year. I live in the thing. I've done everything in it. And it's a technology that still has a lot of myths and misconceptions about it. It's come a long way. It's still early on, but it's starting to show signs of having a real sustained impact on society and health and well-being. And I hope people will keep up to date on the progress. I'm excited to see what happens next.
Fantastic summary. Thank you, Carl, for being a leader in the industry. And it's been a fun 2 hours. I'll give it to you, Bobby.
It has been indeed. Thank you so much for the input and for coming up with a quiz and a wonderful call to action and participating. And I would add, take a look at the weekly newsletter. The point there is to remind people that no matter what's happening in the world, there is every week things are happening and moving and improving in the world of exoskeleton technology. There's something happening. It's a real short format. It's just one title and 1 to 2 sentences. And if you want to read more, you click on it. And if you don't, you don't. There's a job board of sorts at the bottom of it. as well to kind of help both students find internships and to highlight what's available out there in terms of opportunities. We're doing the podcast. WearCon Europe is going strong. The A+A trade fair, which is in many locations internationally, is also increasing their interest in exotechnology, just as a positive note there. And if you like this content, please consider signing up and supporting us on Patreon. It's both a financial help, but it's also moral help. It shows that people are interested and would like to learn more about what's coming down the pipeline and where we are seeing the future of the physical revolution. So thank you for your time. Thank you for listening. And with that, would say goodbye.